Chapter 5. It was getting cold in the den. Coronado started a fire, and he watched it burn. Neither of us said a word for a long minute. Coronado stretched his back and yawned. I knew Coronado couldn't stand the silence, so I broke it for him. "I'm not boring you, am I?" "No, not at all. If anything, Sardina, I'm overwhelmed. But parts of your story elude me." "For instance?" The timing. According to others, what you say happened in months, they said happened in years. They might be right. I didn't keep track. What do you mean? I'm not a learned man, Coronado. Well, you should know the difference between months and years, shouldn't you? Months and years were the same in the jungle. I was too busy surviving. Also, I was told Atahualpa was hung, not stabbed. Which one was it? Which was it? I don't know. I don't really remember. A man your age should remember everything. A man my age can't afford to. Forgive me, but I want to know everything, Sardina. I'm telling you everything, Coronado. Are you sure you're not leaving anything out? I'm sure. I apologize. Don't. I'm anxious, that's all. Your story is... Coronado paused again. The sentence remained incomplete. Silence sufficed. And I continued. I walked around the city with thoughts swirling in my mind. Then I found the body. It was Escobar's. His face was gray, and his eyes were open, and his forehead was smeared with blood. I turned the corpse to his side and found his back pierced with stab wounds all over. I informed Hernando, and an hour later, Escobar's corpse had been buried. At night, a vigil was held. Although there was some concern, there wasn't any outrage by our men. It seemed as if I were the only soul who was appalled. Hardly anyone asked who murdered him. Hardly anybody cared. I couldn't believe the reaction. I was beside myself the entire afternoon. I asked several men what had happened, who was the last man to see him, who was responsible for his murder. I asked one man in particular, but his reaction said it all. "He's dead, Sardina," said the man. "What do you want me to do about it?" Then the man spat on the ground and walked away. I wasn't angry with him, and in certain regards I understood his thinking, but there was something entirely wrong with it. Something was missing. I wanted to ask a priest what was missing in the man's reaction, but no priests were to be found. Was the man right? Was there nothing he could do about it? He probably was. He said it with such conviction. I looked at the other men to see if there was a consensus. It was clear that there was other things on their minds. And when the day ended, I fully knew the limitations of men's empathy and solidarity. Things like that can only last so long. But still, I felt dissatisfied. I kept thinking about what was lost. Empathy? Empathy died when we discovered Cusco. Solidarity? Solidarity died when we left Spain. I should have known these things at the time. It was replaced with the goal that we longed for and sacrificed for. Why should anyone give a damn about one person dying? It was part and parcel, and it just so happened to be Escobar. And, like the man suggested, there was nothing to be done about it. It was a hard, taxing, cold truth. What could he do about it? What could he possibly do? And from that day, I knew the extent of what our people held in regard. Funerals are important, but people grow tired of them quickly. People can be emotional only at spurts at a time. People care only when they're forced to. Nobody knew Escobar. Dead bodies can only have so much respect. Everything has its limitations. At least, that was the conventional thought. At dusk, a mask was held. About a dozen people attended. I saw none of the Pizarros, nor did I see the Almagros. I suppose they were too busy. I suppose they couldn't fit it into their schedules. Certainly, there were other things far too precious to worry about than Escobar. Clearly, they had other plans. I tried to pray, but I forgot the words. Then the priest said a homily. Those words were even more forgetful. We buried Escobar amongst the great walls of the city that the Incas called Xaxhuaman. There were no flowers or arrangement of any kind. There was only a hole and a pile of dirt. And as the day ended, I slipped from one side of the city to another. My thoughts were muddled and confused, and I tried to clear my mind of all of them. Deep down, I knew I was only wasting time. As the hours passed, I noticed a line form along the Almagro side of the city. I kept my distance and lurked about the boundary lines. I wasn't alone. Several others did the same. I walked closer to get a better glimpse and asked other men what was happening. The men informed me that this was Almagro's open invitation and recruitment. The new expedition to El Dorado had begun. "These damn fools," I heard some say. But then a half hour later, I saw the same men who said these words join the others in line. There were about 24 men at first, then the line grew to about 5 dozen. I looked for Soto, but I couldn't find him. All the men paid their fare to Almagro's treasurer and signed a piece of parchment. After the last man signed, the man drank by firelight and sang bawdy songs. They changed the lyrics, and every other word was replaced by the word El Dorado. El Dorado, you thief, El Dorado, you whore. We're about to sing and cry, we're about to sing and die. And that they were. They shouted and hollered for what seemed like years. I searched for Soto again. If there was anyone who knew what was happening, it would be him. But still, I could not find him anywhere. I wondered if he were the first to sign up for the expedition, or if he still had doubts. And I wondered what Cusco would be without him. I thought of the men in Almagro's camp, and I cursed them from afar. These damn fools slept like babies. These damn fools reminded me of how I felt when I left Panama. And these damn fools had the potential to be rich damn fools, even richer than they already were. I wondered if I were making a mistake by merely watching the others join. I wondered if I missed my opportunity. And I wondered if I were the real damn fool for being too tentative and not falling in line. The night had passed. The next day came, and I wondered even more. But what Sardina did not know was that Soto too was among those damn fools. Though he wasn't in line waiting with the others. Rather, he was declined from the very start. It was an instant shock to Soto that he was not asked directly to join the expedition to El Dorado. Neither Almagro nor Diego came to inform him. He learned about the expedition from other men. And when he finally confronted them, Soto knew Almagro was lying through his teeth. But no matter how much truth Soto tried to relay, Almagro refused to listen to him. "I know what you're going to ask, Soto," Almagro began. "Don't bother repeating." "You didn't even ask me, sir. Why?" "I'm not sure what you're saying, Soto." "Why didn't you tell me your intentions?" "My intentions? I have eyes, you know. Ears, too. It's El Dorado, isn't it? El Dorado. Dear boy, you draw hasty conclusions. I draw what I see. And I've seen you paid quite a number of men. It's either El Dorado or you just like paying people. Which is it, Almagro? It's neither. It's orders from the crown. We're headed back to Lima to retrieve supplies. Then why aren't you going with Francisco? We're two different men, Soto. And why haven't you asked me to join? Why should I, Soto? Why should I offend you? Just to beg for your company? On such an ordinary mission? But I went with you before. I'd be honored to join you, sir. Son, you don't realize what you have here. You don't realize the threat either. Cusco needs you more than it needs me. It needs to be protected. The crowd can't afford to lose such a man as yourself. That's why I've asked beggars and boys. They're expendable. But not you, Soto. You're too important. What of El Dorado, then? El Dorado is only a rumor. Cusco was too, sir. Your logic is impeccable, Soto. When we come back and we've assembled enough men, and these rumors are deemed to be true, you can make sure you'll be the first man I ask. But for now, Cusco is the only thing you should think about. And with that, Almagro departed, and Soto returned to his fire. By the next morning, the whole of Almagro's men had assembled. They made their way out of the city, and a crowd cheered and hollered. Almagro's men took out their flags and mounted their horses. Trumpets blared and drums rolled. It was official. The Pizarros looked puzzled and marveled at the sheer number of men who had joined Almagro's bidding. Momentary glances turned to glares. They gave no bows. They shook no hands. They merely watched. The Almagros and magistrates recited their decrees, and the Pizarro scribes documented each word. Then Francisco approached Almagro for the final time. Francisco was the only Pizarro to speak. His words were brief, direct, and amiable. Both Almagro and Francisco knew that this would be the last time they would see each other as friends, and in the public eye they acted congenially, censoring their pure hatred with fake smiles. Deep down, Francisco wished for Almagro's immediate death, and the same was true for Almagro. Deep down, the two patriarchs wanted nothing better than to plunge their swords into each other's throats and watch the blood drip down. But deep down, they knew they could never do it in that instance. That time would have to wait. "I wish you good luck, my friend," Francisco finally said. "I wish you find all the gold in the world." Then Almagro's men set forth, and with 50 horses and several hundred men, they paraded out of Cusco. Almagro mounted on his horse, and Francisco looked up at Almagro from the ground. They shouted again, but their sounds faded. The moment had passed, and they were already gone. But for some odd reason, Soto gave out a great laugh. It was a laugh I was not accustomed to. It was a booming laugh. It was strange and filled with pain. So much so that my heart dropped when I heard it. Soto knew what was going to happen, but at that time, the epiphany was only communicable to him and him alone. He tried to explain it to me, but he was too cryptic. "You're watching a disaster, Sardina. You should be laughing." Then Soto patted me on the shoulder and walked away. It might have been a week later. It might have been more. But when the day came, I wasn't surprised. Francisco gathered his men and hoisted a charter of his own. He set out to establish a province in Lima. Strategically, Francisco had thought about this venture for quite some time. He assembled his chosen men and spoke to them individually. He spoke to Soto first, but Soto declined. Then Francisco spoke to his other men, and within days, his own private army had formed. His mission was to leave Cusco and settle a new city in Lima. It wasn't a new idea. He probably came up with it the second he found Carimaca. The reason for Lima was well known. Cusco was grand, but it was far too inland, and as a result, it was far too vulnerable to foreign invaders. Lima, however, was on the coast, and it served as an ideal place for correspondence and protection. Francisco was old, probably the oldest man I had ever met. He was too wise to make the same mistakes of his past, but there had been a deeper meaning to his departure. And as conventional wisdom had it, most men thought of Francisco's departure as a ploy. I, too, fell prey to this rational thinking for quite some time. The thought was that Francisco was just saying he was going to Lima, while his real intention was to search and conquer El Dorado. But the more I thought about it, the less sense it had made. I thought of the others who weren't hand-selected by Almagro, the others who felt cheated and denigrated and left in the cold. The more I thought about the ploy, the more it just didn't seem right. It seemed that the rumors of the ploy were merely concocted by people who couldn't understand Francisco's withdrawal from power. They simply couldn't understand an old man's contentment with enjoying what he had conquered. After all, bitter people have great imaginations. They didn't know Francisco. They merely shaped Francisco's character and motivation to fit their own story. But in truth, I knew Francisco's departure was not a ploy. It was truly his endgame. That's all it ever was. Out of all the men I knew, Francisco was probably the most aware of his own mortality. And the more I thought about Francisco and how content he looked, even in Carimaca, the more I realized his initial drive was gone. He simply wanted to rule on his own terms, and he knew he couldn't do so in Cusco. Though I suspected the main reason that Francisco left for Lima was that he had foreseen what Cusco was becoming. He saw that it had become a death trap, and in a city so large, he knew his power could only last so long. It was a chronic problem that Cusco presented, and Lima seemed to be the panacea. Lima was always his city, and although small, it was all that he wanted. Francisco had scouted Lima for as long as I could remember, but at that time, he hadn't possessed the gold to be the godly king he always wanted to be. But now, he did. An evening prayer was held, and the next morning Francisco paraded his men on horseback. He embraced his brothers. He probably thought all night of what to say to them. He spoke with Hernando the longest. Then he made a speech. The sight of them that afternoon was a memorable one, and indeed that was the last time I saw Francisco. The scribes uttered the decree, and after it was official, they were off and departed through the city's gates, and we watched them disappear into the sun. And like that, the two giants were gone. Almagro off to find El Dorado, and Francisco off to Lima. In the days that passed, Hernando took control of Cusco. He performed all that was asked of him and treated Manco much as Francisco did. The Incas performed their rituals and prayed to their gods, and Manco served his people and attended every ceremony. He sung and tried to live. and I appreciated the effort. One thing about the Inca people that I adored was their singing. They sang in the morning, noontime, and all throughout the evening. That incredible music of theirs could never truly be conquered, and I found it quite beautiful. But as I saw more and more of our men depart from Cusco, I grew weary. I thought of Spain again. It embarrassed me to think of such things, embarrassed me because my memory of Spain became so foggy. But I thought of it anyway. I saw myself as a lost sheep that was content to be lost. What was Spain anymore? It didn't exist. And I loved that it was dead. The next morning, I awoke and saw Soto sitting calmly beneath a tree stump. He breathed in and out. It was as if something was lodged in his throat. Maybe it was his pride. And of course, I had my questions. But I didn't ask him any. Soto was as angry as I ever saw a man be. His face was red. He refused to say a word, and he stared at me at the ashes of the fire for a straight hour. I watched him for 2 more days. The more enraged he got, the more he paced. He always curtly dictated orders, but this time he barked his orders at his men. All of his sentences were commands. All of his words were abrasive. I set up the board, but Soto refused. He was in his own world. I could see the thoughts spill into his mind, and I could tell the state he was in. Soto was caught in the perilous state of making a decision. The only difference now was that he finally had his fortune. With Hernando now in control of Cusco, the city was as stabilized as it possibly could be. On occasion, there were threats from hostile rival tribes, but those threats were quickly thwarted once the tribes reached the gates. Days passed to weeks. The nearing moon came back pale and big and bright, and Cusco was secure of all things. The Incas prayed in silence. They shut their eyes and tried to see, but still, their demons were ever present, and the air was still stagnant. On the first day of his reign, Hernando sauntered through the city. He felt very content and confident. He looked at Cusco from top a high balcony, and he made it a ritual of sorts to do this at the end of each day. From his view, Hernando saw the Almagro side of the city and marked its differences. For one, Almagro's side of the city looked much cleaner, better organized, and better attended to. At least the stables were. Then he switched his view to his family's side, and he laughed. Things were much sloppier, and their quarters looked very much well-lived. Though, unlike Almagro's side, the Pizarro side of the city was always filled with a mass of humanity, whereas Almagro's side felt empty, stale, and old. Among those who joined Hernando in his meditation was Oriana. Oriana had his doubts, and being a cousin of the Pizarros, he knew everything there was to know. Each day at dusk, Oriana climbed up the steps of the temple and met with Hernando. They shared a chalice of wine, toasted, and whispered an incoherent prayer. The prayer was always the same. It was a secret religion that they alone were privy to, and they never missed a day. Sometimes they talked about how poor they were back in Spain. Other times they talked about their family back in Trujillo. Pig farmers and peasants, starved and pitiful. That was their past. And they laughed and savored their present. There was always more to talk about each day, but the ritual remained constant. They closed their eyes and pinched themselves several times, but every time they opened their eyes, they found themselves still on the balcony, still kings of a golden city, and not another word needed to be said. Though for Ariana, One thing in particular struck his imagination constantly, and that was El Dorado. The rumors of El Dorado had enraptured him to the point of obsession, though for the meanwhile he quite enjoyed his stay in Cusco. He enjoyed the riches and splendor and was delighted in every sense of the word. He looked at Hernando to see if he had shared the same wonder, but there was nothing in Hernando's face that said otherwise. But Oriana knew the reason. Hernando, after all, was the caretaker of Cusco. He was responsible for all things. It would eventually take blame from either his brothers or the crown if he hadn't protected Cusco with absolute vigilance. It was his city now. And with those thoughts, Hernando took in as much wine as he could. Sip by sip, he savored and caressed, and sip by sip, he recounted the events of his life and all that led up to this very present moment. And when he had his fill, Hernando stepped aside and pissed down the balcony. He watched his urine drip down and spray like rain. His whole body quaked, and he grunted and roared like a bear. And as he looked down to see what or who had the misfortune of receiving his gifts, he shrugged and snickered until he had finished. And after he was done, he sighed and let out a great laugh that only Oriana understood. Another day arrived, and Hernando returned to the square. The reason was to discuss with Manco about the city's plans for further development. But to Hernando's shock, Manco was nowhere to be found. He called for his servants and asked for Manco's whereabouts. Then Hernando immediately sent out for a search party to find Manco. The next afternoon, several men approached Hernando and delivered the Inca king back to the city. There was much commotion, and when Manco arrived, the guards pushed him to the ground and smeared his face on the hard clay. Hernando arrived minutes later. He gave Manco a good stare down, then he issued the guards to assist him. For a half hour, Hernando questioned Manco. He grew angrier by the minute, but Manco gave no answers. Hernando pleaded with him, but Manco remained silent. Then Hernando approached Manco and slapped him across the face. He gave a signal to his men. They corralled Manco and tied him to a pole. Hernando then asked the same questions and slashed him 24 times across the back with a whip. But again, Manco said not a word. In fact, he smiled. When they finished lashing him, Manco stood up and retrieved an object from his satchel. The Spanish gawked. It was a golden cube. He raised it above his head and showed it for all to see. The Spanish were surprised. The Incas were appalled. Hernando approached Manco slowly. Without saying a word, he gave another glare, grabbed the cube away from him, and walked away and disappeared into the crowd. The guards approached Manco and sequestered him back into the temple, and Manco smiled. But the reason why he had smiled still eluded Hernando, because what Hernando, nor the guards, nor any of the Spaniards knew was the real reason why Manco had left when he did, and what he did when he was away. 2 nights after Manco escaped from Cusco, he traveled down small hamlets and city-states, which were 20 miles south. He visited the people of those towns and consulted with each leader. Then he gathered 1,000 Incas and assembled them to a secret temple located underground. When all had arrived, Manco made his speech. At first, he stared at the confused brethren, and they stared right back. Sweat poured from Manco's face. Then he began his speech. "These are not good spirits," Manco began. "They are evil spirits. They are devils." He continued. The words flowed and surged. "They have taken over our lands. They have raped our women. They have raped everything we've known." In the midpoint of his speech, Manco summoned the Inca gods to guide him and his people. Then he begged his tribesmen and extended his hands towards them. He emphasized unity, not just of the Incas, but also of all the tribes of the Andes, even those of the hated Hussar. He looked at the leaders and stated his purpose. They do not see us as people. We have shown them kindness. They have not. They have only shown us hatred. They have only done evil. So we shall have to kill them all. The crowd erupted in anger. "What are we waiting for?" said one of the tribesmen. "Let's kill them all now!" The shouts rang and grew. But Manco shook his head and stood still. No. The crowd grew restless. Another tribesman spoke his mind. "You said so yourself. These devils ruined our land. They burned our people. Why shouldn't we kill them now? Why are we wasting our time?" "No," repeated Manco. And with each rebuttal and each play of immediate vengeance, Manco calmed the crowd with a stern and unyielding countenance. No, now is not the time. Then Manco took out a Spanish sword. "They are not gods. I killed one. His flesh was soft." Manco showed the sword to the crowd. He twisted it and reflected it in the light. And this was his weapon. They can be killed, but the timing has to be right. When, Manco? 20 days. 20 days. During the festival of Quiliuque. That's when we'll kill them. But until then, we will be cordial. We'll obey their commands. Until then, we'll lull them to sleep. But when the moment comes, we'll take it. And we'll take back our sacred land. While he was lashed, Manco replayed the scenes and words in his mind. The pain and humiliation were excruciating, but he clenched his teeth and smiled through with a grimace. And while the guards watched him through the night, Manco did not sleep. 19 days he had to wait, and he did his best to keep still. But with Manco's return, he had to accept the inevitable horror. While he sat and meditated, Manco watched his wife Cura fall into the arms of Gonzalo Pizarro. From a distance, Manco and Gonzalo glared at one another. Manco clenched his teeth and shouted and screamed, but Gonzalo was unfazed by Manco's threat, and he slapped Cura across the face many times. Manco rushed after her, and Gonzalo laughed. All the rage that was settling into Manco's body boiled up to his forehead, and his entire face grew red. He came to a halt, but Gonzalo only grinned. Manco darted another glare. It lasted a long, hard minute. Then Manco dashed towards Gonzalo with a knife in his hand. He screamed and stabbed at the air, but before he got halfway, Manco was tackled and taken to the ground by Wamampoma and 2 other Incas. Manco screamed and pleaded, but Wamampoma pulled him away. Manco looked for the final time, but both Cura and Gonzalo had disappeared. Manco finally gave up his pursuit, only to yell out in shrieks of utter pain. His eyes grew wide. His whole body shook. Then the sun faded into night. But his hands still trembled. His 2 guards and several other Incas, including Wamampoma, joined him. And during the night, they enjoyed a meal of llamas and potatoes. But Manco refused to eat. He just stared into the fire. At twilight, the guards went in and out of sleep. The Incas remained awake and spoke softly in the icy night. Manco spoke mostly to Wamampoma. Dialogue they shared proved to be crucial. It took a while, but the logic of the night had finally prevailed, and by the end, Manco understood it in whole. Wamampoma reminded Manco that the plan was of utmost importance. The plan superseded all things. For Wamampoma knew if Manco had killed Gonzalo, the plan would be all for naught. He saw the moves ahead of time. Manco silently played the sequences in his head, and each time he came up with the same conclusion. If he had killed Gonzalo, a slight rebellion would ensue, but it wouldn't be enough. There wasn't enough manpower to enable a prolonged battle, nor was there enough strategic strength to compromise the very logistics of supplying an army. There wouldn't be any hope of any kind. Although it was a righteous act to kill Gonzalo, it would be a devastating one. It would propel a losing game that would eventually perpetuate itself. For if Manco had killed Gonzalo at the very moment, he himself would have been killed, and there would be no one to lead the Incas, and Cusco would forever remain in Spanish control. And as Manco came to terms with it, he stared up at the moon. He nodded at Wamampoma, then he winced and stared into the firelight. At the end of the night, Manco asked Wamampoma what had happened to Cora during his leave, and Wamampoma told Manco the truth. Gonzalo had raped her several times. The shadows of the early dawn emerged. Manco walked about the city in deep meditation. The thoughts haunted him for the remaining days, and on certain days he didn't even want to look at Cora or Gonzalo. He cried every night. He had to torture himself a bit longer. He had to wait. 20 days. 20 long and arduous days. And all Manco thought about was the plan. During that time, life in Cusco remained uneventful. For the Spanish, there was a general relaxed feeling of calm and boring routine. There was no mention of the progress of either Almagro or Francisco, nor were there any mention of further instructions from the crown pertaining to jurisprudence or otherwise. The Spanish lived those days just like any other. They reveled and drank, and they seized the women and gambled. They shouted for no reason, and they prayed when they wanted to. For the Incas, however, those 20 days were utter hell. All they could do was wait, and that was Manco's only command. The Incas walked with a slow, excruciating crawl. At the 10th day, their faces looked swollen. Their eyes turned red, and all could see the angst boiling inside of them. Manco himself showed little emotion. He spoke to his gods and tried his best to talk with Cora, but he did so only in prayer. But what made the Incas confident was the fact that Cusco was slowly beginning to grow in numbers. As days passed, more tribesmen entered the city. They brought with them excitement and enthusiasm that the Incas were in dire need of. They sang their songs and prayed to the sun. They pierced their ears and nostrils with decorated bones. But still, they had to wait. Then one day, Hernando summoned Manco to his quarters. Manco approached the temple steps and was ushered into a small room. The translators gathered. Manco sweat profusely. He answered every question completely and nodded. The main question Hernando posed was the most obvious one, that of the odd sudden surge in the city's population, and Manco explained that they were gathered to celebrate their holy and annual ceremony of Inti Raymi, the festival of the sun. After the questioning, Manco spoke to the translators and requested Hernando that the tribesmen entering the city be treated as guests. After the translation, Hernando stared into the fire, nodded, and accepted the terms. Then Manco left the room and prayed throughout the night. The Incas waited 5 more days, but they knew that on the morning of Inti Raymi, they would see their redemption. It would be laced and woven with blood and tears, but it would be theirs, and theirs alone. Then the morning came, the day of Itirami. Well before sunrise, the Incas were already dressed in their colorful garb, which they wore exclusively for Itirami. At dawn, it rained for half an hour, and the air became cold and dry. The ground was muddy and gray, but the Incas danced anyway. They danced and yelled and laughed until the sun cleared through the clouds, and when it did, it rose high and bright. The Incas' spirits permeated the air. Their drums pulsated with loud bangs and bursts and snares and claps that boomed and pierced. And the Incas danced along. Their prayers were loud and powerful. They were filled with love. They were righteous and pure. And their chants roared on throughout the city. Morning elapsed to high noon, and the entire city reverberated in Inca hymns and chants. Over 1 million people gathered into Cusco for the ceremony, and all of them had flocked over to the main square. The Spanish stood guard and watched the ceremony unfold. It was intense and impossible to ignore, and the Spanish had shared the same bizarre reaction that the Incas had made when they celebrated their feast of Christian saints. They mounted on their horses and patrolled the gates and entrance points. They allowed the approaching tribesmen to enter the city, though they gave them plenty of resistance. The tribesmen soon outnumbered the Spanish, and soon the crowd grew and enveloped into a massive swarm of humanity, and all of Cusco was united in the spirit of Itirame. The Incas continued to pray. Their prayers came in all levels and bellowed from up top the walls of Shakchuaman, down to the main temples, and even towards the chamber below. An hour passed, but to all in Cusco, it felt like a half a year. Another hour passed. It seemed as though the Incas were waiting for some majestic thing to occur, and it was true. They were waiting for the high priest to enter the top of the temple and beset the sacrifice. And when the time came, the crowd erupted. Manco stood amongst the crowd. He stared deep into Wamampoma's eyes. Then Manco handed over a piece of fruit, placed it into Wamampoma's hands, and disappeared into the crowd. The drums blared, and the ritual commenced. The high priest made his way to the very top of the temple steps. The crowd's volume decreased. Then a line of 12 selected Inca children walked forward. The children bowed to the royal court, and from the shadows, Manco appeared with a long knife in his hand. The prayers were uttered, then the high priest shouted, and 12 children were sacrificed and beheaded in succession. The Spanish had seen rituals and beheadings like this before, but they were still in shock. The crowd went quiet. A light mist hovered in the air, and the sun disappeared into the clouds. Then it was time for Tito Acuse to approach. He ascended up the steps. The drums continued and the flutes played on. Their temples accelerated, and the royal court assembled. The child walked forward, and there he met his father. Manco approached Tito and smiled. His hands and chest were smeared with blood. He took Tito's hand, and they knelt in reverence to the high priest. Then Manco held Tito by his shoulders and turned his back against the crowd. They assumed their positions. Manco dangled his bloody knife carelessly in between his fingers. Then Tito knelt to his knees and laid his head flat against the stone altar. Manco frilled Tito's hair and looked over to the crowd. He looked for Cora and found her in the crowd. Then he looked for Wamampoma. He nodded to him, and Wamampoma nodded back. Then Manco turned away and locked eyes with the high priest. He took out his knife and held it high above his head for all of Cusco to see. Then he slowly placed the knife inches away from Tito's head. The crowd gasped. The drums banged faster. Then the drums and dances ceased, and Manco dropped his knife to the ground. He held Tito in his arms, embraced him, and yelled out his battle cry. It was the Inca signal to revolt. Manco's eyes seethed with rage, and his shriek echoed throughout the land. Gonzalo and Hernando stared at each other from afar. They blinked several times. They couldn't believe what they were seeing. They watched the crowd grow to a frenzy, and again, Manco shouted out his soul to all of Cusco. "Away! I am Manco Inca of Vilcabamba!" And the whole mass of Cusco erupted and unleashed their vengeance. The Spanish retaliated and charged their horses onto the crowd. They slammed into a stream of Inca spears. The horses and their riders toppled to the ground, and the tribesmen piled on top of them and choked the Spanish with their bare hands. Later, the Spanish used their crossbowmen and shattered the Incas with multiple strikes. But again, the Incas fought on. In desperation, the crossbowmen retreated to the edge of the city and used the gates as shields. There simply wasn't an alternative. Arrows and spears rained down. The Spanish shielded themselves and their horses. Some fell from the blows. Others, including Gonzalo, screamed and charged up the temples. Hernando stood by the cannons. He looked and waited for the perfect moment. Then he shrieked his commands. "Fire!" The Spanish and Incas fought on in the smoke. Both sides screamed in full-fledged rage. The Incas stole as many Spanish swords as they could and sliced away, and the Spanish fired back. Manco cut his way through with a spear and sword. He saw his men fight heroically, but sadly, it didn't last. The Spanish kept reloading. Their guns blasted through the Incas' defense, and although completely outnumbered, the Spanish gained considerable ground. The Incas fired more arrows and threw more rocks, but again the Spanish kept coming. Cannon smoke smothered the air, and blood splattered to the walls. Hernando squinted through the smoke. He saw some Incas retreat. He ordered more of his men to charge. Sparks of gunfire lit up the sky, and more Inca bodies stacked up. And the Spanish persisted. On the other side of the city, Manco ordered his men to hold their ground. They threw anything they could find. They threw rocks, jars, and fruit. Hernando's men shielded themselves and their horses, and slowly they gained more ground. The defiant Inca warriors remained by the walls, armed with swords. They attacked from all sides, but the Spanish kept pace. Their armor clanged and they sliced away with their swords, but still the warriors egged the Spanish on. Manco held his staff and stared at the green slopes down the valley, and eventually up again to Machu Picchu as the Spanish marched forward. And the battle continued. The city filled up with smoke. The Incas took control of Cusco several times. They screamed and cursed at us in the endless fog. We were afraid. We were all afraid. I saw our men's faces. Their faces were smeared with sweat, and their hands were shaken. Somehow I found myself alive near the end of the gates. I found a corpse of one of my dead comrades. I felt my heart pound out of my chest, and I vomited on my armor. It flew out from my nose. I was soaked in sweat and fear. Hernando, Gonzalo, and Juan shared the same blank look. They saw the Incas take complete control. They saw horse after horse plummet to the ground. But most of all, even before the battle, they saw Manco do the impossible. They saw him lead his people to absolute revolt in absolute confidence. They saw him act like a real king, and the Pizarros were forced to come to terms with their incredible folly. Their puppet had a pulse. The afternoon passed. We were caught at a standstill. We fled to the valley and made makeshift tents that we never thought we would have to make again. The fog lifted. From our view, we saw the firelights of Cusco and heard the Inca chants. We were on guard the entire night. Every man was on edge. I knew the next day would be the same. The next day, too, if I had managed to survive. It rained the next morning. I was ordered by Gonzalo to lead a charge towards the outside gates. Our charge was short-lived. The Incas kept pelting us with stones and spears. We waited for the crossbowmen for what seemed like hours. The cannon struck again, and we watched the Incas scramble back to the main plaza. Towards noon, we finally took control of the gates. The Incas managed to block off our initial strike. Then Hernando ordered us to move further down the valley and establish a gathering point. From there, we contained full control of Sacsayhuaman, which was a complex fortress of high stones and walls. We quickly used it as our main makeshift garrison. Its terrace walls were thick and immense, and its 2 towers overlooked the entire city. We managed to assemble the cannons, and by nightfall, we secured most of it. During the night, the siege suddenly stopped. The Incas did not fight when the moon peeked out. It was a new moon, and their gods forbade them to engage in anything but prayer while it hovered over them. But of course, when the next morning arrived, the Incas returned and charged, and the fighting continued. The Incas proved to be just as vicious as they were the previous days, but with all our forces concentrated on capturing Sacsayhuaman, we had a solid ground to work with. If we hadn't, it would have been all over. Afterward, a segment of the men, including myself, were sent to raid the eastmost temple of the city. Hernando had a rage deploy the previous night, and we led our forces onward for yet another battle. We brought with us several crossbowmen and hand cannons, but most of the dirty work came from the infantry. We slashed and stabbed our way forward, but the majority of the time, we waited. For many hours, there seemed not to be much of a resistance. Then, when we least suspected, the Incas ambushed us from all sides. The cannons fired again. The air was filled with ash and soot, and we swung our swords blindly through it. Round after round blasted above our heads. We surged onwards. 3 of our men went down. I heard them choke in the ash. Then in the distance, I saw Inca crawl to the ground. I blinked to see if I was dreaming, but I wasn't. It was Manco. He turned to his side and choked. Then he made his way to his knees. I saw that his face had been covered in soot and blood, but I knew it was Manco when I looked at his face. As he turned to me, he glared, and for that moment, it seemed that Manco and I were the only 2 living souls on Earth. It was 1 second, but it lasted an eternity. And at that moment, I saw Manco's acceptance of his own death, and that alone made me pause. I saw in his face that he was ready to die. He was ready to die or keep living, one or the other. But what amazed me the most was that he wasn't afraid. He was truly lost in the moment. For whatever reason, I could not kill him. For whatever reason, I just didn't have it in me. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe I was too tired. But I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't plunge my sword. Then the moment passed. Emanco took no hesitation. He made it back to his feet, and I watched him disappear through the fog. The cannons roared with another set of rounds, and I was left with my sword in my hand. There wasn't a soul in sight for the longest time. I stood in the ash and watched it swirl above me, and I choked and fell to the ground. The siege lasts for 5 more days. Every day seemed as if it were repeated, and I fell into a trance. All I could do was stab, pierce, and swing. When I entered the Pizarro camp, I knew something terrible had happened. Hernando, Gonzalo, and the entire Pizarro family gathered near a flame. Their faces were cold and gray. They stood and cried and stared, brooding in anger. I asked what had happened, but I got no response. Then I noticed that Juan was absent, and I remembered what happened the day before. And like an idiot, I put 2 and 2 together, and I still could not believe the obvious truth. I replayed the hour in my mind. I was ordered to be on point and defend the south position. Although there weren't any other counter-raids, we waited in angst to back up a cavalry charge. Soto was with me at the time, and I remembered the pain in his face as he winced and waited. Then the orders were finally called. We rushed forward, but the Incas were waiting for us. They threw their spears and fought us for a very long time. Then the cavalry swooped in, but they were late doing so. The Incas managed to climb up the walls and threw their projectiles down. Then I heard an ungodly scream. As Soto and I trampled over the dead corpses on the ground, we stabbed at the charging Incas. I saw the cavalry surround and charge again. They stormed like they always did, but many riders dropped from their horses. And Juan was one of them. But at the time, I didn't know. At the time, Juan's body was just another corpse. I probably stepped over it. I had no time to pause. I found myself back at the Pizarro's tent. I watched the brothers move from their quarters over to the hospital tent, and I joined them soon after. Then I saw Juan's body on the ground. His entire face was bloodied and scarred. I knew Juan was dying then when I looked at his face. He gasped for air and coughed up blood. But in another hour, his body went cold. I found out later that he had been struck upside the head with a stone and then speared in the stomach with a lance. He had led the charge. He was the voice I heard scream that ungodly howl. Hernando returned from the post with Juan's corpse. He carried a lit torch and moved from the tents to the far end of the walls. He put a cap on the torch and let the smoke rise. Then he dropped the torch to the ground and cried. A small mass was held a day later. The priest returned with a white wooden cross and planted it to the ground. Gonzalo kept extremely quiet and stayed by the wall. He overlooked the bodies and dead horses and squinted through the smoke. He whipped his head back and forth as his mouth quivered. Then he looked at the priest. They marched with crosses and lanterns of incense in their hands. He returned to Juan's body and whispered a prayer. The fighting continued. More bodies were stacked in a giant pile, and our men lit them on fire. And when the day ended, Gonzalo climbed up the walls of Sacsayhuaman, looked down at the Incas, spat, sneered, and finally, he yelled a primal yell that pierced the air and echoed throughout the Andes.